Hello everyone, my name is PJ and welcome back to the Void in another episode of The Hoarder. In the last episode, the party came face to face with Gorshak Shadowcleft, the Orog warlock of the Hoarder. He explained a lot of things to the party, and then after they parted ways, they fought their way all the way back to the Druid camp. Lots of fights. But when they got there, they finally reunited with Balthazar, after Balthazar had taken Zaymot's father Borin back to Rivercrest. Balthazar was guided back to the Druid camp by a Black Bear Druid, or rather a Druid disguised as a Black Bear, and the leader of the Druids offered the Black Bear's assistance once more as additional thanks for taking down Velzol to guide the party to the edge of the forest, as close to Port Last as they can go, because beyond the forest is out of the Ring of Swords jurisdiction. So they do so, and they reach the edge of the forest, but once they get there, they hear this loud, clanking sound, like a pair of footsteps that gets unbelievably loud by the time it reaches them. The party all decides to hide among the trees. 4 of them climb up into the leaves, and 2 others, specifically Zaymot and Balthazar, stay on the ground and hide behind trunks. When the clanking footsteps stop, they hear a voice saying, "I smell it. I smell blood. There it is," and then it starts running in Balthazar's direction. Balthazar has an attack readied, and when he comes out from behind the trunk, he swings at whatever it is, only for it to just kind of bounce off their shoulder. And he gets a good look at this creature. It's a very small, old man. He looks like a gnome with gray hair and a long, red-colored hat. He is wearing these huge iron boots and holding a sickle that looks way too big for him. It looks sized for a large-sized creature, not a small one. But either way, this red-capped creature takes Balthazar down in 3 swings of his sickle, and he turns around and he sees Zaymot standing by the tree, and he looks at him and says, "You're next." So Zaymot bravely steps forward in order to get within range in order to heal Balthazar, taking the red cap on mano a mano. They come within the center of the trees that they were all hiding in, and while Elton is up in the trees firing arrows, the druid, disguised as a black bear, is just hiding. This druid wants absolutely nothing to do with the red cap, and it doesn't really care all that much whether the PCs succeed in fighting it or flee. Really, the black bear is just waiting for them to flee. He doesn't expect them to win. The party struggles to fight the red cap. It's very strong, but as soon as they realize that every time, like an acid splash for example, hurts his hat, he goes out of his way to wipe the acid off of it, but not his own skin. They start to get the feeling that this red cap of his is important, so they start trying to damage it, and that just pisses him off. Then at one point, they actually manage to steal it, and they run off with it. That gets the red cap's attention. He completely ignores all of the other party members and does not even consider fleeing even when his health gets low. In his vain attempts to get his hat back, they manage to take him down, and he crumbles and disintegrates into dust, leaving only his sickle, his iron boots, and the red cap. Not wanting to take any chances, the party burns the red cap so that there's nothing left of it. And then they take the sickle, because it's big and strong and cool, and I tell them it does 2d4 damage, which is better than a typical d8 weapon, but that you'll have disadvantage on wielding it because it's sized for large creatures. The red cap just happens to be able to wield it without disadvantage. They don't bother taking the iron boots. Either way, they part ways with the very traumatized Black Bear Druid and continue on their way toward Port Last. They manage to spot, from a long distance, a group of ghouls. They don't recognize them as ghouls at first, but they decide just to avoid all contact with any other creatures and just go around, which costs them a little bit of time, but it doesn't really matter because eventually they find the road and using their navigational skills realize that if they head north, they will arrive at Port Last. The next morning, they do so, only to find that there are guards stationed at all of the entrances, both human and orc. The citizens of Port Last now appear to be working together with the Skullcrushers. So Chit approaches them, and the guards are shocked to see him. They immediately demand that Chit and his allies relinquish their weapons and follow them to Captain Dothwinter's quarters. They are reluctant to do so, especially after the orcs see that Balthazar is wearing the helmet and wielding the axe of their former leader. They get super pissed off, but in the end they decide to cooperate, and they hand over the axe and all of their weapons. They pretty much take everything of value from them, and they are led to the guardhouse, and then to the jail cells. They realize that something is up, but they are now unarmed, and they don't really want to cause a scene until they figure out exactly what's happening. So they're locked up, and after a while, Dothwinter finally shows up and expresses equal surprise to see Chit there. He thinks that this is all a trick. He never expected Chit to show back up because he believes that Chit is behind the recent disappearance of the highwayman. Chit has no idea what happened to it. And Chit tells him absolutely everything he knows, but Dothwinter already knows it all. He knows about Gorshak Shadowcleft. He knows about the men in blue with the crystal rod. He knows about them. He knows everything, which means Chit has absolutely no useful information for him. So he says to him, "Goodbye, Mr. Stromkin." And then he walks away. The party decides to wait, and later that night, they hear in the distance the sound of grinding. The party immediately recognizes it as the sound of a weapon being sharpened, and they decide that right then and there is the best time to break out of prison. While Serge is busy using his chromatic orb because they never took away his ring to melt the lock of the cell, they hear flapping just outside the barred window. In pops the head of a baby bronze dragon with a scroll tucked in its mouth. It mumbles in Draconic, "Are you Balthazar?" And Balthazar responds in Draconic, "Yes, I am." And then he spits out the scroll, and the baby dragon says, "Mom wanted me to give this to you. You were very, very hard to find. Okay, bye." And then it flies away. So Balthazar picks up the scroll, and Chit asks him to read it aloud. And it reads, "Chit, do not go to Port Last. Go north. Trust me, we'll explain later." And at the bottom is a drawing of 2 gears. "God damn it," Chit says. Either way, the party breaks out of the cell, and they start working their way out. They succeed on their stealth checks, so the guard stationed in the front room does not hear them sneaking up. He is busy writing something in candlelight, and Chit uses his newfound prestidigitation power because he reached level 4 and took Magic Initiate, so he took a few Warlock powers to represent his connection to Chandracool. He used prestidigitation to snuff out the candlelight. Now, the guard is none the wiser. He thinks that just burned out on its own. So he immediately starts rummaging through the drawers trying to find some flint and steel. And by the time he's able to relight the candle, everyone is standing around him, and then they knock him unconscious. Non-lethally. They have no intention of murdering anybody. Not unless they attack them first, anyway. So the front door is there, and they have the keys, but they can't leave without their weapons. Chit especially is not leaving without his gun. So they continue exploring the guardhouse, and they find the barracks. Most of the guards still here are asleep, but 2 of them are playing cards via candlelight, both of which are orcs. Serge decides to turn invisible, and sneak over to the other side carrying the keys. He very carefully unlocks the door and pulls it open without making any squeaking sounds. He goes inside, and for starters, he takes the most important weapons to the party. He gets Zaymot's warhammer, he gets Grizzle Todd, and when he picks him up, he's like, Is that you, Mommy? Because Grizzle Todd has been really quiet up until this point. And Surge contemplates pretending to be Grizzle Todd's mommy and saying yes, but realizes that that's a bad idea and just tells him to shh. Then he continues looking throughout the room. He finds Chit's gun, and he also finds Chit's longsword, but then he also finds an additional longsword, a very pretty, ornate longsword with gems in the hilt. He finds Balthazar's great axe, the one that he took from Velzel, and that's pretty much it. Surge didn't want to risk taking much else because they were on a time crunch and didn't want to risk spending too much time and getting caught, so he just grabbed the essentials. Oh, and he got Zaymot's shield. He didn't bother grabbing his own weapons because he figures those are easily replaced. So with all the weapons on Surge, they become invisible too, and then he carefully brings them over to the rest of the party. So, now that they've all been re-equipped, they go to the front door, and they look outside to see a bunch more guards patrolling in circles in front of the guardhouse. Surge, still invisible, decides to run over to a pile of barrels and crates and start knocking things over to get their attention. With the guards thoroughly distracted, everyone else sneaks around the building to the other side, because Port Last doesn't really have any walls, so they can just kind of walk out of town. The guardhouse is on the very edge, which is how the Bronze Dragon Wormling managed to go to their window without anyone spotting him. Surge almost gets caught by the guards. They see that something is knocking things over, and they surround the area where he is. They can't see him, and they still don't know exactly that he is there, but they know that something is invisible because when Surge tries to sneak past one of them, he fails and accidentally brushes up against them. So the guards begin swinging in the direction where they felt him, but since he's invisible, they all miss. Surge manages to get away while they look around trying to find whatever this invisible thing is. And Surge manages to get away and join his friends. Chit has absolutely no intention of staying here. He wants to follow Tilda's instructions and head north. Even though they don't rest for the night, they pull an all-nighter. I make them all roll their con saves. They all succeed. They pull an all-nighter without sleeping, but none of them are exhausted for it. They follow the road north. When it's almost morning, they once again enter Valerius's territory, just like they did in Session 2. And they see Valerius flying overhead. They whistle at her, and she begins flying in circles around them before flying to the west, toward the ocean. The heroes begin following her. She's not flying super fast. She is flying at a normal pace, but the party still can't really keep up with her, even moving at a fast pace. Eventually, though, Balthazar, who's leading the group, sees her dive straight down and disappear into the ground, just beyond the horizon. When they finally reach the horizon that she disappeared under, they find themselves standing on top of a very tall cliff overlooking the vast, wide ocean. And right about now is when the sun breaks the horizon to the east just behind them and lights everything up. And they can see the ocean, sparkling with the light behind them. They look down, and they see that there are some spiky crags, because that's why it's called the Stored Coast. There's lots of spiky crags everywhere, except for the area directly beneath them. The water directly beneath them is clear, and even though it'll still deal tons and tons of falling damage for them to dive into it, they could theoretically survive the fall. But while they're looking down there trying to figure out where Valerius went, they hear someone screaming from behind them, "Strongkin!" Walking up from behind them is Captain Dothwintle, out of breath and accompanied by a couple dozen guards. He is very furious, and they didn't see or hear him coming up from behind them because they were all traveling at a fast pace and were taking a huge dip to their perception scores. And none of them are particularly perceptive to begin with. Chit has the highest perception in the party with a +4. Dothwintle continues to pant as he begins screaming at Chit. "This is all your fault, Stromkin. You couldn't just let things be, could you? You just had to have the highwaymen all for yourself. I had to pretend for all these years to be giving you the opportunity to fix it so that you can leave. I had to send you into the Neverwinter Wood to get killed. But no, you don't put other people's lives or happiness before your own. Port Last is in danger now because of you. You could have just handed the highwaymen over to the orcs in the beginning, and we'd all be over this." Chit is shocked by what he hears, but not all that surprised. He knew that Dothwintle was corrupt, but hearing that he had been conspiring with the orcs all along, honestly kind of par for the course. And it explains why those orcs from the very first battle of the campaign were able to get into town unhindered. They were let in. Dothwintle says that he should have killed Chit years ago, and that now he's going to right that wrong. So he pulls out the executioner's axe that they heard them sharpening the night before. And this executioner's axe, I briefly mention, although I don't think the party caught this, it's painted gold, just like Velzol's great axe was. But they don't really notice that, because immediately Surge already has a plan. He tells everybody to jump. His plan is for everybody to jump down into the water, and he's going to cast Featherfall on everybody. The party doesn't really question it. They would rather risk falling into the water with Featherfall than fighting a veteran and 24 guards all at the same time. So Elton is the last one to jump, not being completely sure whether or not he should trust this plan, but everybody else did it, so he figured, what's he got to lose? So everybody jumps off the cliff. Dothwintle is really confused by what's happening. He gives him this puzzled look, thinking that they have all given up. But as they are falling, from within the cliff emerges a big white blanket, like those trampolines that firefighters use to catch falling people, and they're all caught within it. And then they hear a cranking noise that causes this curtain to tilt downward and drop them all onto the deck of the ship that had just emerged from the cave that was hidden in the cliffside. Chit looks around and he sees that he is on the deck of the highwaymen. And Tilda is there to greet him, and she says, "Wow, okay, I didn't realize you guys were just going to jump on your own. I was just going to yell up and tell you to jump," which was my plan. The original plan was that the fight with the guards would go on for 3 rounds, and then they would hear someone shouting, telling them to jump. But they did it anyway. So the highwaymen, just like Tilda had been instructed, had been fitted with masts and sails to make it a seaworthy vessel. And seaworthy it is, except right now it is currently being pushed by an adult bronze dragon to get it as far away from the coast as they can. Dothwintle sees this happening and is like, no, and he grabs the arrow and bow of one of his guards, ties a rope to the arrow, fires it at the top of the mast of the ship, grabs the rope and swings down, George of the Jungle style. Although impressed by that feat, Surge still just very casually points up, fires a firebolt at the rope, and severs it in 2, causing Dothwintle to fall into the ocean. He swims back up to the surface and tries swimming after them, but he cannot outswim a bronze dragon, no matter how hard he tries. and as he sees them getting away, he gives up, exhausted. No! No! And he starts pounding the surface of the water with his fists, screaming Stromkin's name to the skies. And as the party celebrates, Valerius stops pushing the boat, flies up, transforms into a beautiful human woman with long bronze hair and bronze scale armor, and lands on the deck of the ship. She looks to Balthazar and says, "Balthazar, my dear boy, it is so good to finally meet you in person." And Balthazar is completely speechless. He's so giddy and so happy to finally meet his ancestor too. And honestly, everyone in the party is pretty taken with her. So she finally explains that she has been keeping an eye on her longtime rival, a blue dragon named Zephyrath, who runs the Zephyrath Empire far, far to the east. Balthazar recognizes the name. Zephyrath is his other ancestor, where he gets his blue scales from. Servants of Zephyrath had recently come into possession of something that Chit has been looking for, the crystal rod, confirming their suspicions, and are bringing it to an island far to the west in order to deliver it to a higher-up member of the Zephyrath Empire. She also explains that it's been her job to protect Port Last, because that's what bronze dragons do. They are war tacticians, military dragons, who protect coastal towns and cities. So her job was to protect Port Last, and as soon as she saw that the orcs were on their way, she flew down and warned Tilda to get the highwaymen out of there, and that she would send Balthazar and Chit her way. So Tilda grabbed a few people from town, as many supplies as she could, and Valerius helped push the ship all the way to her lair. Which she now has to find a new lair, since the guards pretty much knows where she lives, and they're probably not going to let her off easy with helping these fugitives escape. So she transforms back into a dragon and goes off to do just that. So as they watch her disappear, Chit looks to Tilda and asks, "So exactly which people from town did you put on board?" Oh no, 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 and then he hears a familiar voice pop out from the hatch that goes below deck, and a man looks at him and says, "Chet, buddy, old pal." It was Parzish, the human male merchant who had tried to swindle them so many times before. He was there, but Chit wasn't having any of his shit. He told him that since there is no longer any law out here in the ocean, except for what he and his allies have to say, that Parzish better not even think of screwing them over at all. And Parzish is like, "Duly noted, no swindling here, not that I would ever do such a thing, buddy." So the party decides to start exploring the ship. They find that several people that they had previously met in Port Last are on this ship. Clara, the lizard folk maid from the tavern, is there, as well as the tavern keeper, Falgor. The old man who kept asking for free drinks and talking about the end times was absent. Haljal, the mountain dwarf with the collapsed lung, was working on the ship as their personal blacksmith. And then, of course, there's Parzish, who will be their merchant and personal trader and be in charge of their funds and such. Unless the quartermaster wants to do it, which leads me into the next thing the party begins deciding on is who should have which responsibilities, because a ship is a big responsibility. So Tilda is going to be the bosun. She is the ship's engineer. She has proficiency with carpenter's tools and tinker's tools. That's how she built these masts, and it's also how she built these benches that sit inside the deck of the ship that can be lifted up out of it and used to row oars whenever there's no wind. So she's the crew handyman. Handy-go. Whatever. What's more, the party doesn't necessarily need a surgeon for the crew because they've got Zaymot, who has magical healing. So he's got them covered for that. But then comes the big issue. Who should be captain? I explained to them, using the rules from Ghost of Saltmarsh, that the best captain is whoever has the highest charisma. And even though Chit has dumped charisma, Surge, who has the highest charisma, is currently suffering from 2 afflictions that make him worse at it. So the two decide to become candidates and leave it up to a vote. They both give speeches, telling the rest of the crew why they should be captain. And even though Chit pretty much constantly keeps advocating for Surge to be captain, they all end up voting for Chit anyway because Surge fails his roles and Chit succeeds at his. So Chit is captain. He may not be the best fit for the job, but hey, there's always mutinies.